Hello, let's get up and running with Adobe Muse. I'm Megan Pfister. I'm the Central Pennsylvania Adobe User Group Manager, CPOG for short, and I'm also a WordPress website developer and designer for small businesses. If you want to get in touch with me, you can reach me on Twitter at CPOG, C-P-A-U-G, or at Megan Pfister, that's my personal account. So this presentation is geared towards people who are entirely new to Adobe Muse. Maybe you've opened it once and then backed out realizing that you weren't quite ready for that. If you've heard of it and you're not quite sure what it is or what you can do with it, that's what this presentation's for. If you are some kind of super sweet Adobe Muse guru, you are going to be bored. So maybe you should come and present. That would be really great. But this is for beginners, people who are just getting comfortable using Adobe Muse, or may want to learn a little bit more about the new responsive web features that have just been created. Adobe Muse, quite succinctly, lets you create HTML5 websites without knowing how to code. Basically, what it does is it's a program that lets graphic designers create custom HTML5 websites, but you don't have to know how to code to do it. It's all designed visually. More and more we've seen, if you work in the industry as a print designer, that you're being called upon to create websites as well. Now, some people relish that and other people loathe it, but regardless, it seems like most jobs that you have, or if you're even a freelance web designer, or I'm sorry, a freelance print designer, you're going to have somebody ask you about building a website. So what Muse is it's geared towards print designers, people who are not familiar really with creating websites from scratch. So you design visually, not with code. So again, you don't need any code knowledge. It's really very much geared towards graphic designers and non-developers. So if you know how to hand code and you're super comfortable with that, you may still find Muse to be helpful, but there's some things that we'll talk about in the future that Muse does have some drawbacks on. So if you're all about coding, hand coding, you're better off going into Dreamweaver and doing that yourself or using some other HTML editor to do that. If you have Creative Cloud, it's included as part of your Creative Cloud subscription, or you can buy it as a standalone product. So if you're only interested in Muse, you can buy that separately as well. And they now have responsive web design built into Muse. This is very new. It's new as of February 2016. I will say, kind of a side topic here, is that I was interested in Muse. It intrigued me for a while. It's been out for a while now, but I never really put much time into it until recently when I found out they were going to include responsive web design. Now, prior to that, you could build out separate tablet and mobile sites, but to me, my philosophy is that responsive web is the way to go, and I wasn't going to spend a lot of time trying to learn a program that would not handle that. So when I found out that Muse was going to be building in some responsive features, then I was interested in, that's when I started looking into getting up to speed here with Adobe Muse. So you're going to kind of see what I've learned recently over the course of the last few months and then weeks as far as responsive web design goes and how that relates to Adobe Muse. So who should use Muse? Use Muse, I love that. You should use Muse if you are very comfortable with the designer-friendly layout programs, especially the Adobe Suite programs like InDesign, maybe Photoshop or Illustrator, but very specifically InDesign. There's a lot of parallels between Muse and InDesign as far as how you structure pages and all that goes. So if you like InDesign, but you're afraid of code, Muse, you're going to love Muse. That's pretty much the bottom line on that. Again, no coding. So if you have never touched HTML in your life, Muse is for you. It really integrates well with the different Creative Cloud products. So if you're comfortable, again, with using Photoshop or Illustrator, you'll be able to take those assets and bring them into Muse very easily. They're integrated very well together. Muse is good for smaller projects, And it has really nice interactivity features that are easy to set up. So sometimes, it's kind of funny because back in the day, and even now sometimes, setting up web forms is just such a hassle. Muse makes it incredibly easy. So if you want to be able to get a website up and running quickly, it's a small project, you don't want to deal with code, but you want to have a nice site, Muse is for you. Muse is not for you if you like to modify the code or if you're a hand coder. You can view the Muse code, but you can change it, but then it's a one-way street. And we'll talk about that a little further. But basically, if you want to get something up and running with Muse and you want to go in and change it and then think that you can keep those changes, it's not going to work for you. It's not meant for that. If you have a large site, like hundreds of pages, Muse is not going to be right for you either. It just doesn't make sense to use Muse for that kind of site. If you have a small, let's say, restaurant website, it's going to be perfect for that. And that would be the kind of site I would recommend for it. But if you're looking to do, CNN, don't use Muse for that. It's just not appropriate for that. If you're going to be building something then handing it off to developers, they are not going to be happy if you do that in Muse. They are going to tell you this is not going to work. And then that's that. So just know that if you're working with developers, it's not going to work for that. And then also, if you plan to use something like WordPress or some other open source CMS, it's not going to work for that as well. It's just not meant to integrate with those things. So it is part of Creative Cloud, and again, you can buy it standalone if you'd like. You also have access as part of Creative Cloud to thousands of fonts, and that includes Typekit, and then you've got Muse, and then you can even self-host your own fonts. So there's a wide variety of options for you design-wise, and especially if you're, I'd like to think that print designers have like a font fetish, as I like to call it, and Muse does not disappoint in that area either. You can include stock images directly through Adobe. Adobe now has a stock website that you can purchase from. Now you can use whatever images you want, assuming of course you own the rights to them and stuff, but you can have super quick integration if you use the Adobe stock photography. So that's available to you as well. And it behaves just like creating a layout in InDesign. There's a lot of interactive elements that are really easily integrated with Adobe Muse. Things that can get tricky, especially if you're not comfortable with HTML, Muse makes very easy. Menus can be generated either manually or dynamically, and I'm going to show you how to do dynamic menus in a little while here. Links and anchor tags, no problems. Buttons with rollover states, very easy. All this is done visually. Things like light boxes and slideshows. You've got contact forms. Your widget library has a lot of options for that, and that's also expandable too through third-party markets. And things like scroll effects, so maybe like a parallax effect, which we're not really going to get into today, but just letting you know that it is available to you. So things that can be rather complicated, especially if you're not comfortable with code, Muse makes it very easy. It's pretty much a click and drag kind of thing, and you change your settings and then you're good to go. There's also the availability for advanced functionality, which again, we're not going to get into today, but just know that it's available to you through widgets, things like blogs and e-commerce stores. You can go to your library panel and download new items. So there's some stuff that comes by default, and there's other stuff that you can download to expand it further. There is like a whole kind of third-party market system available to you that you can get paid items. Some are free, some are paid, and I'll give you some resources on that at the end of this presentation. But pretty much most of them are click and drag the widget onto the canvas and then you style it. It's really that simple. Now, again, I mentioned that it used to be that you would have to create custom mobile sites, and you can still do that, but now you have the option of responsive web features. So you can define your different breakpoints and different customizations and go from there. It's nice because it's all done visually, so you can shift your breakpoints and see it visually where the site looks kind of wonky, and then change your breakpoints for that and create customizations based on how you want the site to look at that particular breakpoint. If you're not comfortable with breakpoints, I would suggest just doing a little bit of a search on responsive web design and breakpoints so that you understand what that means. It's basically where the width of a screen and how the site changes based on the width of the screen. That's the simplest version of that. You have several options to publish your Muse site. You can FTP it to any website host, so whatever website host you might have, like GoDaddy or Bluehost or any of those, you can just FTP it up like you normally would. Again, if you're not familiar with uploading a site through FTP, you've got a couple options with that. One, you could get familiar with doing that. Your other option is to host with Adobe, and that is part of their Business Catalyst system, and I'll talk again about that a little bit more here. But basically, if you want the simplest way to get your site up, use Business Catalyst. I cannot speak to the guaranteed uptime and all that. I really have not explored that, but I can say that Muse is meant specifically to integrate with Business Catalyst as far as website hosting goes. It also makes Muse site updates very easy, and we'll talk about the pros and cons about that later. The other option you have is you can just export it to like a desktop folder if you want, and you can explore it locally on your machine. You can explore the code that way if you want, but remember that if you modify the code, it will not carry through to Muse. So it's a one-way street on that. So Muse workflow, like generally as a print designer, for example, you're gonna maybe work in Illustrator or InDesign, maybe some Photoshop. You're gonna get your assets ready for in Illustrator and Photoshop, then you're gonna take them into InDesign, and then you're gonna export that as probably a PDF to your printer, and then they're gonna print it out for you, and there you'll have your final product. As a web designer, you may, it depends on how your workflow is, but let's say you work in Illustrator and Photoshop to get your mock-ups, you've got your assets, your various like visual assets that you want. Then you go in and you code it through HTML and CSS. Now some people don't do mock-ups and they decide that that's not the flow they want, but either way you're gonna have to code in HTML and CSS, and then you'll have your final website. With Muse, you're basically going from very much like the print designer where you're creating things in Illustrator and Photoshop, then you're gonna import them into Muse, and Muse creates the code for you. You don't have to go through a coder to do that. Oh, actually, let me back up a second here. I don't know if we'll have time later to talk about creating the code, but the code that Muse exports is pretty good, pretty good. If you are a hardcore coder, you're going to see mistakes in it. You're going to see things that is not as clean as you would like. Sometimes maybe there's an extra BR tag or some non-breaking spaces that you wouldn't normally put in yourself. But compared to years ago when some of these, what we call them WYSIWYGs, what you see is what you get designers, some of those were just atrocious. When I've looked at the code that I've seen from Muse, it's not bad. So take that for what you will, but it's nowhere near in the past if you've ever worked with any of the old school stuff where you would get code exported and it was just the worst thing you could possibly imagine. So it's all right. It's not perfect. It could use cleaned up, and I'm sure as each iteration of Muse comes out, it will get better and better and better. But you don't necessarily have to be afraid of it the way you may have been, or I certainly was, years ago with some of those other programs. So basically, Muse is InDesign for the web. Muse is to website building as InDesign is to print document design. And if you are comfortable with InDesign, you should find the step over to Muse very comfortable. And let's look at some site examples. So we're going to get some starter designs from Adobe. These are ones that Adobe has put out. Now they have a list here. Let me bring this over. This is available at resources.muse.adobe.com. And here are some of their starter designs that they have available. Now they have responsive, they have a couple responsive ones. These are new. And then they have just the regular. And let's look at the difference. So this is the one called Exposure Starter. This is non-responsive. So when I go here, the graphic changes a little bit, but when I get down below, you'll see it doesn't really shift. It's not, if I look at this on a phone, it's not going to look all that great. It's going to be a small version of this. These here are just for the demo. It tells you like little features about it. It wouldn't be on the actual download that you get and put on your own website. Now here is the responsive version of that same site that they redid using the responsive web. So you'll see here, we hit a breakpoint. It's going to change a little bit. Now we hit another breakpoint, and now you see it's shifted around to be more tablet friendly. Oops, just just left my window. Okay, and then if we go down even further, you'll see a final breakpoint here for phones, and you'll see it changes there as well. So it's really shifting down and really reformatting everything to look good on mobile, where the other one just kind of got smaller, but it's not responsive. It's somewhat responsive in the fact that if you had a large screen, it would look proper on all those screens, but as you get into, let's say, tablet and mobile, it's going to look terrible. So I would recommend always just going with the responsive version. So we saw the preview for this responsive one. I'll show it again just because we were busy doing that, but you can kind of get a sense of how the site looks. Here's an example of like a built-in slider that they have. This is a single page one, so these are just anchor tags that are going down here. You can see how a gallery would look, and this is all built in. And then let's look at one more here. This is the, I cannot even pronounce this, so I'm just going to say this one. So we can see here, this is a multi-page site, unlike the other one, which was a single page. So we've just clicked on menu, and we can see the menu. And again, these are just tips to show you on this demo page what's going on here. But these will not show up on your actual site. So here's showing you like background images, location. This is something I'll show you a little bit later here about adding a map to your site. Here's a reservation system that you've got like a different form here that you can fill out, and you can see it's styled nicely. This is all available to you in Muse. This is all right out of the box kind of stuff that you can do. And then there's some additional tutorials here as well that you might find